I want to thank you all and welcome you to the 40th annual Harney County Migratory Bird Festival gone virtual. This presentation is the History and Archaeology of Harney County with Scott Thomas. So our festival is made possible every year through the support and enthusiasm of our community partners. That is everyone from nonprofits to federal agencies to local businesses and community members. We're really fortunate to have such a committed community to making this happen year after year. I'm Janelle Wicks. I'm the Executive Director of the Friends of Malheur National Wildlife Refuge. I serve on the committee that plans the festival, and I'm really excited to be with you guys all today and throughout the weekend. So welcome. What you can expect from this presentation is about 40 minutes of presentation from Scott, then a little bit of time of question and answer. We're going to ask that everyone remain muted throughout, and please find that chat box. Feel free to type your questions and comments in there, and I will moderate them throughout the hour. And we'll save questions for Scott at the end, and I'll share them with him. So I'm going to ask too that you stay through the end of the Q&A, because I do want to share what's happening through the rest of the weekend with the lineup for the Bird Festival. So here we are for the History and Archaeology of Harney County, Part 1. We're going to have Scott back again tomorrow at 11 o'clock, so don't miss that. Scott Thomas earned his Bachelor's of Science in Zoology from OSU in 1975 and a Master's of Arts in Anthropology from Portland State in 1982. He worked for 24 years with the Burns Bureau of Land Management and retired in 2018. His research interests are varied and include the Clovis Age sites, buffalo hunting circa 1500 AD, edible plant harvest, 1700-year-old Rimrock draw, the Rimrock shelter, which is pictured here, and the prehistoric pottery, all in Harney County, along with some public archaeology. In his spare time, you might find Scott gardening, surf fishing, or fashioning a willow basket. Today, Scott is going to be presenting on edible spring wild plants of the Harney Basin and a World War II B-24 crash in the Pueblo Mountains. Please remain muted through the duration of the presentation and write your comments and questions in the chat box. There will be a short question and answer session at the end of the hour. And without further ado, Scott Thomas.
Thanks a lot, Janelle. Now I'm going to have to change screens here, so I'll need a second. Uh-oh. Yeah. And then the beginning. Did I click that? There we go. Sorry for the brief intermission before we even got started. For those of you that aren't from Harney County, my presentation, even though it doesn't sound very archaeological and it's not obviously archaeological, it has a lot to do with the American Indian people that lived here for thousands of years before European settlers came in, Euro-American settlers. And the place we're talking about is basically all the mountains and hills surrounding Burns in Harney County. All those places are very rocky, and we're known for our lots of rocks in Harney County. So the plants, most of these plants I'm going to show you today, they grow in places where the soil is very rocky. This first slide from on the beginning of the introduction is a photograph of camas fields east of Burns on Highway 20. I was lucky enough to get this shot before many of these camas fields had been turned into alfalfa pivots, but it just shows you one of the most important roots ever gathered by American Indians, especially all over Oregon and in Harney County, is the blue camas. Okay, what am I doing wrong here? Help me. Oh, there we go. This is a photograph of typical edible roots in the spring. And I took it years ago, but last night I decided to identify some of the plants within the picture. I didn't do all of them, but the bitterroots up on the upper right-hand corner, that's a very rubbery looking, kind of anemone looking plant that blooms later, but it's dug when it's green like that. And all the yellow flowers in the picture are biscuit roots, primarily the most popular variety, which is one named by Lewis and Clark called Couse. And then the pink flowers in the photograph are a giant version of clover that was also edible because it was sweet. But as you can see in my text in the bottom, it says most edible roots like rocky ground, and the rockier the better. We're going to go through a progression of slides that show you the various edible roots kind of from the earliest to the latest. And right now, this time of year, maybe even earlier, maybe a week or two, this is the first one that blooms. It's a tiny little plant. You can see by my scale, the dime there. And it has a pretty good sized root underneath it. It's called Lomation Ravenii. And most lomations, and that's another name for biscuit root essentially, most lomations taste faintly like carrots, and they have kind of a spongy pulp. They're not the most exciting thing to eat, but if you have that to live on, you're going to live on it anyway. The next plant is another biscuit root called Lomation Ravenii. And this was kind of an interesting one because originally it was thought to be a rare and endangered plant, or at least a rare plant around here. But I was able to luckily discover a new population of them in my working in the root ground areas. And we've got several thousand acres of this particular type of Lomation now, so it's no longer endangered. But it's a very attractive little plant. Again, very tiny and not too hard to pick out if you're staring at the ground, but it's not obvious on the landscape. This is one of the larger Lomations that's kind of a mid-season, so it'll be probably starting to bloom now. And this one, I never really could figure out why people would eat these, because when they dig them, they smell like kerosene, really strongly like kerosene. And but there are women, native women, that still dig these. And I think one of the ones that I know that digs them, she trades them for bitterroot with a friend of hers, and salmon with a friend of hers up on the Columbia River. I don't get the attraction because they have very strong smell, but that doesn't mean anything. It's all depends on your taste. This is the one. This is the Lomation or Biscuit Root named by Lewis and Clark. In fact, the native name on the Columbia River for this plant is Couse, and that's why they used the word Couse as a species name. This is probably one of the larger biscuit roots, and it's a mainstay because it's so prolific and it's diggable for quite a while. These plants are probably beginning to bud, almost ready to bloom, and they'll be available for probably about the next month. And how all this fits into archaeology is that the Indian people that lived here before Euro-Americans settled had a seasonal round, which meant they traveled from place to place over the season, over the growing season, and harvested plants and hunted and fished for animals, and kind of worked their way around a region. Maybe some people have suggested something like 1,000 to 2,000 square miles where they ranged. And then they ended up in the fall around water availability, usually in lowland settings that were sheltered from the wind, and they stayed there for the winter. But then when spring came, and the first thing they did pretty much was head up to the hills to do root gathering. And it's a very, very important part of their economy in prehistoric time. We find evidence of different kinds of charred edible roots in fire pits that we've excavated over the years. But it's also very important to their modern day population too. There are a number of people, mostly women, but a number of people from the Burns Paiute tribe that collect roots every year. And some of the roots have become ceremonial, and they celebrate the beginning of a new growing season. But also I think there are people that still dig enough to consume them regularly. Now this is the largest biscuit root. I forgot to mention, I've got scales that are confusing here. This picture right here has got a quarter showing you the size of the plant, but then the bulb picture has got centimeters. So I mixed up my European and English measuring systems in one photo. But the roots on these biscuit roots are large, very large. But unfortunately, they tend to grow in the rockiest places you can find. So they're a little bit difficult to dig with a digging stick. And I don't know what I was possessing me, but I should have included a photograph at the beginning of a digging stick. But mainly the modern day digging stick is a curved piece of metal about 3 feet long with a pointed tip that's made out of spring steel, so that when you pry on things, it retains its shape, with a T handle, and I've got a couple of them. So, but the ones that were used in prehistoric time were made out of hardened hardwood that had been put in the fire to harden the tip. This is one of my favorites and I always eat it when I'm out and about. This is called Indian celery. It's another member of the Lomation family, but its roots are not necessarily edible. The part that is edible is the shoot shown in the upper right hand corner. Very strong celery flavor. In fact, so strong that if you use too much of it, like I did making a stew a number of years ago, all you can taste when you're done making the stew is celery. Even if you put a lot of other good stuff in there, it's just celery flavor primarily. These tend to not require rocky ground. They tend to grow in wet areas. And you don't have, like I said, you don't have to dig them. You just have to pull up the shoots and pop them in your mouth. This is a cute one. This grows widely in Eastern Oregon and Central Oregon, for that matter. It's called yellow bells. At least that's what locals call it. It's in the lily family and a fairly small plant, and it has a little bulb on the end of the root that it's kind of oval shaped. It looks kind of like a spaceship, sort of. I have eaten these once, and I don't remember them having a whole lot of flavor, but they were very crisp and juicy. But it is definitely an early spring bulb. And I'm sure when people had gone through the long winter with a dwindling food supply, they would probably be really happy to see these little yellow flowers. This is another one of my favorites. It's an allium, onion family. There's two different varieties that grow in this part of Oregon. We all assume that an onion is supposed to taste like an onion. Well, these don't really taste like onions. They're in their same family as garlic, and they taste like garlic. Very strong. I used to take them and mix them with leftovers in my lunch, take the flowers off these and throw them in my leftovers, and they're a great garlic flavor. I think if you eat too many of them, you might get a stomach ache, but that's probably because they're so strong. But these are available for a couple months, from right about now till late May. This is my very most favorite. This is the Indian carrot. And even though it's called a carrot, it is not a carrot. I mean, it does not taste like a carrot anyway. It's in the same general family as Lomation, but it's slightly different. The bulbs are difficult to dig because this one likes deep soil and has a real fragile stem. So you have to really be careful when you're digging these, because otherwise you're going to pull up a stem with nothing on the bottom. But these are tasty. They taste a little like a combination between a water chestnut and a green pea. And they're usually available in late spring. So basically all this, we're talking about a range of time that these roots are available. Indian people would go up to these root grounds and they would camp for months, for at least 2 months, maybe 3. They would be harvesting these type of edible plants and drying them all the way along. And in this part of the world, there used to be a salmon-bearing stream called the Malheur River. It's no longer salmon-bearing because it's been dammed up pretty much from beginning to end. But they would also harvest salmon at about the same time as the root harvest. So they would camp for several months in the same place. And in the areas where there is root ground in Harney County, there are thousands of archaeological sites, ranging in age from potentially 8,000, 9,000 years ago, all the way up to maybe 150 years ago. But obviously, these root grounds were very important to the Indian population, and like they remain today. But if you ever get out, if we ever have a spring tour that is on the internet, and it's actually in person, I would love to start a new tour sometime in the future where we actually get to go out to the root grounds and see the different plants in their natural habitat, and we'll dig a few roots. And so far, I think the favorite of everybody has been the Indian carrot. This is probably the most attractive of all of the spring plants that are edible. It's called Bitterroot, and it was named after Lewis of Lewis and Clark. So its scientific name is Lewisia rediviva. Rediviva meaning, I guess, lots of different parts. But if you look at the lower left, you can see the root system. It's long and spidery. And then after the green part that looks kind of rubbery, shoot goes down in the ground, it basically dries up, and then it blooms right afterwards and has these beautiful cactus-like blossoms. I have eaten bitterroot before, raw and cooked, and it's probably good for you, but it's not something that I would eat intentionally much because it's kind of bitter, and when it's dried, it probably isn't any less bitter, but when it's dried, it looks like pasta. You can take the bark off the skins or the roots really easily, and they're white. And when they dry, they're beautiful bone white. But they're made into kind of a mush I had once, and it was mixed with salmon, so it was pretty good. But like I said, they're very valuable to Indians all over Eastern Oregon, and especially valuable in times before Euro-Americans got here. It's probably the most expensive dried of any of the roots. There is a market for them, and different Indian tribes would probably trade for them. But bitterroot is probably the most popular root out there, and for reasons that are more nutritional maybe than they are taste. This is a really spectacular plant. This is a balsam root. We're getting into the sunflower world now. These guys they tend to like better soil than most of the roots do. There's another variety in Harney County that's got a kind of a grayish green leaf that isn't scalloped like these leaves. But both bloom right about now, another 2-3 weeks. And if you're able to get to them early enough before they bloom, the shoots were eaten. Apparently, I've never eaten the shoots of these because I never seem to get out there early enough to get some. And they also had a sunflower-like seed on them, although quite a bit smaller, available in the summer. But like I said, when these guys bloom, especially after a wet winter, they're fantastic. There's yellow covering the sides of the hills. Another beautiful sunflower, and this actually is interesting. It's called mule's ear, and it's named after Nathaniel Wyethia. The summer seeds are edible because they're in the sunflower family. And the interesting thing about this plant is that even though there's a white one, there is also a yellow one. And apparently they're the same species, which kind of surprises me. But all I've seen in Harney County so far are the white ones, although I've seen yellow elsewhere. Beautiful plant, nice big daisy flowers, and seeds later on. This is another one called, that blooms probably later than spring, so it's not really a spring edible plant. It's more like a early summer, but it's called the Mariposa Lily, and it's incredibly beautiful. Also edible, and it's another lily family. And then there's the one we talked about at the beginning. This plant was the mainstay of Indian tribes all over Oregon and Idaho and probably Washington. Every place you see on a map that says Camas this or Camas that, that would have been a huge important place for Indian people. These guys are, they like deep soil, and they tend to like wet areas. So any fields that are flooded in the spring, like they are in Harney County, you will see camas popping up all over, and that usually doesn't bloom until June. People have talked about the fact that there is a relative that lives in a different environment that is highly poisonous. It's called death camas, and it has a white flower. But really, you'll never see death camas in fields on the flat like this in the damp places, because death camas only grows in rocky soils up in the uplands. But anyway, these plants, I've eaten these things raw, and I've eaten them baked. And the Indians used to bake these in an underground earthen location, and they smoked them basically and dried them for about 4 or 5 days, and then retrieved them from the pit. Those are much tastier. The cooking makes them sweet and smoky. When they're raw, they're like chewing on something sticky, like you would if you're eating paste as a grade school child, like I did. Anyway, they're definitely not good raw, but they're definitely good cooked. And let's see what else. I think that's about it for that roll. Are we going to ask questions between the very end, or are we going to ask questions at the end of this and then at the end of the next presentation?
Scott, I think that it might be nice to just take a minute and see if anyone has any questions.
Yeah, that's fine.
If you do, go ahead, please put them in the chat box. I had a question really quickly about the balsam root. Is this the flower that's blooming on the south side of Wrights Point right now?
Yes, it is. It's the other species.
Wonderful.
And it likes slopes, as you noticed. Every day you drive to work, you go over the top of Wrights Point, and you're right. The south side is usually covered with the other species of Balsam Root.
Well, that's awesome. And Jeff Schmidt asks, are most of these bulbs best cooked? And if so, I'm wondering how.
Okay, well, the interesting thing about biscuit root, I'm sure they ate them raw or cooked when they freshly dug them. But what they usually did to prepare them when they were storing them for long term is they dried them. And then when they had this dry biscuit root meal, and they would basically rehydrate it. They grind it first on a mortar and pestle until it made kind of a meal, and then they would add water and probably some sort of animal fat, and then basically fry them like, I don't know if they really look like a biscuit. They probably look more like a tortilla, but cook them on a hot rock by the fire. And I'm assuming that's why they're called biscuit root. But most of these plants were eaten fresh when they were dug, but I'm sure they ate many of them after they'd been dried and turned into a powder or just dry whole.
Great. And we have one more question, and then we'll move into your next slideshow. What resource would you suggest for identifying these plants of Oregon?
Wow.
Or have you developed something similar to the eBird app, kind of like iNaturalist, or something where you could go in and identify the plants based on their characteristics?
Well, that's interesting you asked that question, because like, for instance, if I do know where many of these plants are, and the best way to determine where they're going to be is to use the soil maps available for Harney County, and anywhere you have thin soils that are derived from basalt rock, base rock, that's where you're going to get roots. I wouldn't probably advertise where they're located because, or many of them are located, because tribal people do still dig them there. And so I don't want to encroach upon their traditional activities because it's really important to them. But there are a number of places, like for instance, Steens Mountain, which is the largest rock in Harney County. It is loaded with roots, and I don't think people gather much there anymore. The areas around town, to the east of town, 20 miles or so, those places are more used by the tribe, partly because they're closer to burns, and that's where many of them live. But identifying the plants, well, that's a tough one. Many of these plants are not in books that I know of, you know, like your typical guide to wildflowers of Eastern Oregon or whatever. I guess the best place I would think to look, gosh, and of course my memory is failing me now because I'm old, but there are two resources that I would look for, and there's a woman named Marilyn Couture who did her master's thesis on the seasonal round of the Harney County Paiute. And I can't precisely remember when it was published, but it was the early 80s, and it's probably available through Portland State master's degree type lending library or even electronic library, PDF. That is probably the best guide to edible roots and other kinds of plants in Harney County because she specifically studied this area. And her last name was spelled Couture.
Great. Well, I am going to suggest maybe, Scott, we can find that resource and put it with this video, these that will be shared through the Harney County Migratory Bird Festival Facebook page and YouTube channels.
Right, and I could provide the other reference. I just need to. I haven't got a copy of it at home, but I know where there is a copy at BLM, and I could get the information there and let you know what it is.
Great. And then I want to mention to everyone who might not be seeing this in the chat that Elsie has mentioned there is an app from Oregon State University called the Oregon Wildflower Search, possibly. But I'm sure that if you were to go into your app store and Google and search Oregon wildflowers, you would probably find that app and be able to download that. No, Scott, I think your timing is perfect. Thank you so much.
I've never been told that my timing is perfect, ever.
Well, today it is.
Oh, good.
I want to open it back up to questions. So go ahead, everyone, open up your chat box. And if you have a comment or question, please feel free to type it in there and I will moderate that for Scott. We did have a final question about the first presentation about local native edibles. And Jeff Schmidt asks, as an Anglo person, you know, approaching it with no academic value, is it okay to dig these plants when you see them out in the field? And
I would say number one, be sure you know that they're edible. And the best way to determine that is to, well, book learning, but also seeing them in the wild. Now, I'd be happy to share the pictures of these with anybody that wanted to see them. The other thing, because I don't want you to go out and dig something poisonous and die. That'd be bad, especially if you dug death camas. But the other thing is, if you see any tribal people around digging, then I would go somewhere else. There's plenty of root ground out there. But if you really wanted to go someplace where you probably weren't going to be interfering with tribal practice, I would say the hills around Steens, the South Loop Road, both borrow ditches of that loop road are full Lomation cows, which is the main biscuit root, every year. They like disturbance. They're not at all unhappy with being stuck in the bar ditch. But I've been driving down that road in the spring, and it's lined with yellow flowers on both sides. So yeah, I would say if you see them somewhere and you know for sure that they are the edibles, go ahead and give them a try. Indian carrot's the best though.
Yeah, I would just add to that, you know, some general practices, you know, for folks, you know, you can, first of all, you do want to know whose land you're on, what land you're on.
Yeah.
There are different protocols on, say, a national wildlife refuge versus BLM as far as harvesting is concerned. So you want to make sure that you're aware of those rules. And then, you know, there's sometimes when you're out picking huckleberries for, say, you want to take one, leave two, you know, or give an offering, or, you know, understand the cultural significance, if there is any, of the area where you might be. So those are things you might want to think about and educate yourself on before you harvest.
Yeah, that's what that was one thing. I'm glad you mentioned that. Definitely, if you're digging roots, go for the biggest and leave the rest, because there's plenty of them out there. But if you over dig an area, then it takes a long time for it to grow back.
So we have a couple more minutes. These were great topics. So if anyone has any additional questions, Steve is asking, Scott, did you discuss the plant that I call the bladder? I got to show the show a few minutes late. I'm seeing them up on top of the steams. They have a flower that looks like a kidney shape, and they are the texture of a balloon.
Yeah, those are probably, I'm thinking those are an astragalus, which is also can be called loco weed. So you definitely don't want to eat these because they're called loco weed. They're probably hallucinogenic and somewhat poisonous. But I think I know what you mean. That the flower pod, the pod that comes on, the flowers look like a pea flower because they're related, and they could be of a number of different colors. I've seen them yellow. I've seen a real cute little tiny one that's got purple flowers that has a real light colored leaves that are almost white. There's several varieties, but and the small purple one, when it gets ripe seed on it, they're fuzzy, coated with fuzz. But the one you probably are talking about is a different variety that's got a pod that looks almost like a large kidney bean. And it's kind of a balloon-like thing. It looks like a little balloon. And I think it's a bit on the slightly yellow, light yellow color, maybe with darker spots. But I definitely wouldn't eat these because unless you're really into that kind of thing, because I know they are probably slightly poisonous.
Really good to know. Thank you, Scott.
Sure.
Great, we've got maybe 2 minutes left before I want to wrap things up with some information about what's happening the rest of the weekend. Anyone? Oh, Jeff says they are toxic to livestock.
Yeah, they would be. Yeah, and I know another one you see a lot in the root ground is a variety of delphinium called larkspur. That's also not edible, poisonous, and it's poison to livestock.
Excellent.
I missed his last chat. I saw it pop up, but I didn't get a chance to read it.
Steve says that when he goes to the top, it looks to him like a plant nursery for everything growing lower.
Oh, the top of the steams, especially in late July, early August, is unbelievable. You'll see everything. You'll see plants you don't see anywhere else around here, as far as I know. But you'll also see a lot of the dwarf varieties of plants, or maybe they're just a regular plant that doesn't grow very big at 9,700 feet high. But it is amazing. In fact, I think the entire area of Eastern Oregon is very, even though people think it looks kind of desolate, if you get out of your car in the spring and look around, you'll see tons of wildflowers, and not just the edibles, but there's flowers everywhere, especially on if we have a good snowpack or a good rainy winter. Yeah,
it's a beautiful time to be out here.
Yeah.
people flock, bird joke, in the spring, but there's never a bad time to be in Harney County. There's a lot to see all year long.
I love this place. It gets under your skin.
Yep, for sure. Okay, well, with that, Harney County Migratory Bird Festival is made possible by a collaborative effort of all of these federal agencies, nonprofit organizations, local businesses, and community members. It is a lot of work that goes into making this happen every year, and we're really proud to be a part of it. So thank you so much for attending and valuing that. And we hope to see you again next year in person, if not through the rest of the weekend in these virtual programs. So thank you so much and have a great afternoon.